Hi, so I want to finish up today our study of being in nothingness by looking at the final section of the chapter on concrete relations with others. And in this section, he basically looks at our experience of being part of a we. Now, in a sense, that's been what this whole chapter on concrete relations with others have been about. Right? In both the issue of love and sex, the issue is, are we a we in what we're doing? Are we really sharing that experience? And what he's showed in those two profound ways that interpersonally we try to establish a shared experience with someone, that it's the very nature of experience that it can't actually be shared. So though we're trying to do something together in those cases, we never really are having one experience. We're each having our own experience. And the difference between our two subjectivities can't ever be overcome. And what that means is one of us has to always adopt the role of looking, and one of us has to always adopt the role of being looked at. I mean, who's doing which can change back and forth, and indeed it does. But the point is, in any situation, at any time, we actually have to not be having the same experience. We have to be playing out different roles and so on. Anyway, and that's roughly what he meant by saying the original experience of the real being for others is one of conflict. It's this fundamental disparity between how we're being defined and so on. Anyway, now he's going to look at another situation. Like, don't we experience being part of a we in a bigger sense, in being part of a community or something like that? That's what he's going to look at. He's going to look at the experience of a we outside, or let's say beyond the context of individual relationships with another person, right? Outside the context of a pair, but in the broader situation. And he's going to, we do have experiences of being part of some kind of we, but he's going to look at what those he's going to look at the two forms that experience takes. The experience of being a we in the sense of a subject, and the experience of being we in the form of an object, which grammatically we call an us in English. And so we're going to look at a set of situations in which we experience ourselves essentially as a looked at we, which is an us, or a set of experiences where we essentially experience ourselves as belonging to a looking we. What we're going to discover in both cases is that, once again, of course, you're still on your own. You're still only experiencing your own experience by yourself. You can't experience anybody else's experience, and nobody else can experience yours. And so in that sense, there isn't really a shared subjectivity. But we're going to see in what sense we do nonetheless experience ourselves as having a kind of belonging. So I'm going to, I think this section again is really, really outstanding and insightful, especially because of the core thing he's doing in showing the relationships between those we experiences and forms of materiality. And that's what we're really going to pick up on when we go from here into the critique of dialectical reason. And this section of the chapter is basically the launching point for the critique of dialectical reason. One of the nice things about this section is that it's, in addition to being really insightful, it's relatively short and fairly easy to read. I think that the things that Sartre says here are quite clear, providing you've been more or less understanding the things that are going on. So I'm not going to go through the text in detail. I'll make some relevant quotations and so on, but mostly I'm just going to try to talk through some of the sort of core points. And so I want to start by looking at an image. Here, this is an image of obviously people on an assembly line. And the thing you can see here is that, they're all in there together, and they're all, doing something that is working together. But, as you can imagine, none of them is working, these are women, so none of them is working for herself. They're all working for someone. And surely the materials they're working on, similarly, are someone else's materials. Here's another one. This is people working at a construction site, building something. And again, it's a bunch of people working together, cooperating with each other, and so on. There's a big project they're working on, which is, in this case, I guess maybe they're tearing up a road and they're going to put down a new one or something like that. But the thing they're working towards is the thing they all have as their goal to produce that, and they're all doing their steps in the process. But the thing they're going to produce isn't going to be theirs, the road, and more importantly, even I guess the jackhammers they're using and that little tractor-like machine, I can't remember what you call it, with the little shovel at the front. Those things are not theirs. So once again, these people are all working towards something together, using someone else's things, and where the thing they're going to make is not really their own. And then let's look at one more here. Here are a bunch of people working in, just sort of an open office space, and no one of them, I'm betting, bought that sort of greeny workstation divider stuff, right? All over you see these sort of uniform workstations, uniform chairs, the institutional kind of carpet, which I can't stand looking at. The office building itself, right? Those people all go to work and they work in the space. And again, for none of them is that space or the material set of things they're working with theirs. And presumably the computers aren't theirs either, although who knows exactly the circumstances there. But what I'm imagining is that each one of those people goes into work and works with all these resources and in this environment that is it's their workstation. It's the workstation they're supplied with. And they all work individually together on whatever the larger enterprise this business is involved in. So the thing there is that all of those people presumably do have a sense that they're doing something together. I mean, I can't speak for any one of those individually, but most people have been in those kinds of situations and do experience themselves as belonging to a certain kind of group. And the thing about that situation there is that they are belonging to a group, but they're belonging to a group where, they're clearly employed by someone for a purpose that is not their own, using materials that are not their own. So in that sense, they are all working for someone else. And so they experience themselves as belonging, but as belonging to a kind of a kind of group that is looked at, right? Belonging to a kind of group that is, just to repeat that expression, for someone else, for an employer who is supervising them, dictating the terms to them, analyzing their work, and so on. So in that structure, those people for the employer are all, my workers, if I'm speaking as the employer. Those people are all for the employer, employees. They're all workers. And that's the identity they live. They live out a sense of themselves as the employees. So Sartre says, we have these interpersonal relationships. He says this back on page 538. We have these interpersonal relationships of love or sex or whatever, where we're a pair. And there we live out those situations by kind of withdrawing ourselves from the larger world. Or, we make the rest of the world kind of the background. And we only focus on the terms of who we are for each other. And that it's within that context that all those relationships and all those issues that we discuss get played out. But the fact is, we aren't the only two people in the world. And so we can go from being wrapped up in these kind of more intimate relationships to experiencing ourselves and our coupling as belonging to a larger human world. He says on 538, like this is what happens when you get introduced to what we could call the third, which on the one hand just means a third person, but also it means more broadly just sort of the introduction of the third perspective, which can be occupied by anyone. And the fact is, we, in our perspective of I and you, are always in fact, in principle, contextualized by the broader perspective of whoever else is there seeing us or who could see us. So we are always them, an us, a he or a she or a they for someone else, someone who is not involved with us personally. So at the same time that you are a you for me, you're also a he or a she or a they for someone, for all of them. And so he says you can that actually comes up experientially when you're, romantically, however, wrapped up with someone and someone interrupts you. Like someone could accidentally walk into a room when you're kissing someone, or you can just be having a romantic, intimate moment in a more public place, but then somebody else comes into the park. Go back to that park scene he described in the initial description of the look, and instead of picturing yourself there privately when a second person comes in, go back and think, okay, you and your romantic partner are sitting having an intimate romantic moment on the bench when somebody else comes in, and think about what's transformed there. So he says what happens when our pair is perceived by a third is we now experience ourselves as having a kind of solidarity, like it's us perceived by them. Because whereas our roles, I shouldn't say because, but the form that takes is, whereas our roles are distinctly different for each other in our pairing relationship, for that third, we are equivalent. We're just, two lovers on the bench, right? And two lovers on the bench means an identity that applies to each of us equally and indifferently. Or, even more broadly, I could be just walking down the street with my boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, but there could be many other people on the street, and someone looking down the street sees all of us as just people walking down the street, right? And I and my girlfriend or boyfriend can experience that. We can experience ourselves as looked at as just one of those, millions of people on the street. I mean, that's kind of the example he gives here at the beginning of the chapter when he's talking about being in a cafe. And, you may be interacting with some other person. You catch somebody's eye, and you're playing out whatever kind of game you play out of looking or not looking at the other and whatever. But then there's a car accident and you both look over there. In that case, he's talking about how you experience yourselves as kind of shared subjects looking out, which we'll get onto. But it could equally be the case that, instead of a car accident, someone comes up with with a gun, or it's just a cop who says, okay, all of you, I need you to go do something, or whatever. Suddenly you could be have it announced to you by a third that you are all part of a group, and you could experience yourself that way. And so your relationship with this other that used to be a kind of intimate thing between two people who made a pair suddenly becomes, I or we are one of that addressed group. Anyway, so as I said, that's what he's talking about in 538 when he talks about moving from the pair to a new situation that's introduced by coming into your experience of a third. And he says on 541, he says that when that happens, from the bottom of 540 at the top of 541, he says, this means that I suddenly experience the existence of an objective situation form in the world of the third, in which the other and I shall figure as equivalent structures in solidarity with each other. Basically, we experience ourselves as sharing a kind of identity, which is the identity handed to us equivalently within the perspective of that other person. So that's the basic structure, and that's what I was then going back to say about these workers in the office or on the construction site or in the assembly line. They in as much as they experience themselves as workers, are experiencing themselves as under the gaze of the one for whom they are working. And under that gaze, they all have equivalent structures. They all have equivalent identities. And so it remains the case that you and your coworker may hate each other, or you may be rivals, or you may be falling in love, or whatever. Like, you can also have all those paired relationships. But to the extent that you experience yourselves as, one of the workers, you are living out of a sense of a shared identity that is the experience of being one of those looked at by the boss. And he says, again, this is an experience, and this I think is quite important. It's a running theme throughout this book. He says this is 541, about 8 or 9 lines down. He says, "This is precisely what I experience non-thetically, and without having any knowledge of it." So he says, again, like you live out of this sense of who you are, which is to say you live out of this sense of being looked at as one of a group. It's not a matter of thinking about it. I mean, you can think about it. We're thinking about it right here. You can think about it. You could have it as a way you explicitly come to reflect on yourself and think about yourself and so on. That's always possible. But that's not the thing he's talking about. He's talking about the way that you can live from this identity you adopt in the experience of being looked at as part of a group, and have that as kind of a platform on the basis of which you then engage in all your other kinds of working. There's a kind of lived sense of shared self-identity that we have. But so I hope that basic idea that we have such a sense of a we is clear enough. And as I said, I think the thing that's particularly powerful in the way Sartre writes about it here is the way that this is communicated to us in and through a certain kind of material reality, namely the tools we work with. Right? So when you have this kind of job where you're using those jackhammers or sitting in that office space or whatever, your variability to engage with those things presumes your adopting of this sense of self-identity. So going back to this non-thetic point, it's in your proper way, your necessary way of being oriented to that task, that you have to assume this identity. To be someone who can work with those other people on constructing the road or whatever it is you're doing requires of you that you sort of insert yourself into the world of this equipment, and in so doing live from a sense of yourself as this equivalent member of this we that is constituted by the gaze of the employer, let's say. So your orientation then is towards the task. That's the thesis, the posited object of your work, which is shared work. But you are oriented towards that as someone who is sharing a task, right? And that's the non-thetic, non-positing experience of yourself as part of this group. So that's your sense of a we. That's your sense of a shared subjectivity. But it's a looked at we. It's the we as object. So it's an us. So he says, you experience that insofar as you pick up that jackhammer to work on the task and so on, right? You're directed at a task through material means on the basis of a certain kind of shared, basis of a certain kind of sense of yourself as part of a shared subjectivity, right? And that's why he says, so on 543, he says, we have therefore experienced ourselves as apprehended as an us across a material object to be created. There he's talking about the thing you're supposed to produce, the road or something like that. But the point is that it's by or in and as your engagement with this materiality of the object to be produced by the material means you employ. It's in your experience, in and as your experience of that materiality, that you can have this sense of yourself as a we. And so it's that linking of the materiality and this sense of self, shared sense of self, that I'm particularly interested in, and that is going to be what we're going to continue to look at in the Critique of Dialectical Reason. And so I like the sentence he says then right after that on 543, line 3. I think this is kind of the motto of what we're talking about now. Materiality puts its seal on our solid community. That's basically then what we're talking about. Okay, so I want to now move from there as this basic discussion of the we as an us. That is to say, the we who is the object being looked at by someone else, a sense of sharedness that comes from experiencing ourselves as equivalent members of a kind of group defined by the gaze of another, looked at, in other words, to now looking inside of the look. What now he says is the experience of being part of a we construed as looking. This is no, the we subject as opposed to the us object. And again, I want to start by looking at an image. Here's an image of a stop sign, and here it's basically telling you that you have to do something. And then there's another sign that is telling you which way you have to go, and so on. These signs speak to you, but they're a little different from the jackhammer, because these are things that come up for you in the course of your everyday pursuit of your own activities. So these things, rather than being these are, again, kind of material objects. They're things you encounter in the world. But rather than being things that tell you how you're looked at, they tell you more how you're supposed to carry out your looking, right? Insofar as you are enacting your plans and projects and doing things, this is how you're going to do that. Let's look at a couple of other examples of that. Here, this is just a street in Istanbul, actually. When you walk down a street, like, you're doing your own thing. You're just out with your friend. Maybe it's that romantic partner and you're going to do something together. But as you do it, you walk on the sidewalk. And, the car comes down the road and you don't even particularly have to notice it, because the car comes down in the place where cars are supposed to go. And you're careful, not to just go walking out across the part where the cars go. So, in other words, the very makeup of these sidewalks and roads is the same as that stop sign, the same as that one-way arrow. You don't actually have to have signs with words written on them. Rather, the very way you have learned and become habituated to experiencing these bricks and whatever else makes up the sidewalk and the road is as things that articulate for you the terms in and through which you are to carry out your subjectivity, your practices. And these are, of course, terms that others share too. So everybody who walks is going to walk on the sidewalk, and everybody who drives is going to drive on the road. And so your experience of walking on the sidewalk is an experience of participation in the shared way that we do things. Just because I like Istanbul, I thought I'd put up another picture here. The same thing. In this case, it's not cars, though. It's the distinction between where you're going to walk and where you're going to sit to eat dinner, right? And in the same way, you and everybody else there knows how to respond to these things. And so all the people interacting in that situation feel themselves as competent, comfortable agents in walking down the street, sitting at the table for dinner, and so on. And you're not put off by someone else walking on the sidewalk. You're not put off by someone sitting down at the table for dinner. They do what you expect of them, just as you do what they expect of you. So that's what I'm trying to get at there, again, is this idea that here you carry out your own activity, they carry out their own activity. But in doing that, you and they are all living out of a sense of how we do things. And in that sense, we mutually validate and reinforce each other's sense of who we are by the fact that we all do things the same way. Right? Here is an interesting one. This is a Varanasi in India. These women are doing something extremely normal in Varanasi. And so to have these women walking around in those kinds of garments, carrying these things on their heads, functions for the people who live there, for the rest of the people who normally live there, the same way those sidewalks and tables function for the people walking around in Istanbul. I put this picture up though because I think if you were to walk in, downtown Guelph or downtown, Manhattan, Kansas, which is a small place, or I don't even, I can't. Maybe in Luton, in outside London, England. I can't even think of the places, but there are lots of places where you could just plop these women down acting like this, and it would look very strange. It pointedly would not look like the way we do things. Right, so the reason I want to bring that up is that, I want to introduce the idea that our sense of our we as subjects is again, just like our sense of the we as object or the us, is again enacted through materiality. But if we then focus on the materiality, you can see that the same materiality doesn't articulate a we to everybody. This articulates a we to some people, but to others it would not be their we. This is two people sitting in a restaurant. This is not unlike that situation of walking down the street and the sidewalks. Like the restaurant similarly presents a set of structures. Like you don't get in the way of the people sitting behind you. You sit certain distance apart from each other. You eat your food on the table and so on. Like again, this is something where everything, where each of these people, in acting as the single individual that they are, also lives out of a sense of how we do things. So there's a kind of we subjectivity happening here too. But for others, this would be quite alienating. Like there would be situations in which it wouldn't really seem proper for a man and a woman to be sitting and having dinner like this together, especially if they're not married, or perhaps for the woman to have her head uncovered. There could be all the very way they're eating dinner, the incredible informality of this. In various contexts would not be acceptable at all. For a man not to have shaved his beard. In some cultures, beards are everything. You got to have them. In other cultures, you got to not have them. In ancient Greece, for example, it was the thing for men to do to have beards, whereas in ancient Rome, men were clean shaven. And those kinds of cultural norms continue in some contemporary societies. And so here, for people for whom the culture that these diners belong to, for people for whom that culture is their own culture, these people seem just to be doing what a person does. But for others, this would not be what a person does at all. This would be what people who don't know how to behave do. Right? And so in the very way these people act, they are both living from and sort of articulating and reinforcing a sense of a we subject. And so it's in the material practices that our sense of belonging is articulated, but again, non-thetically. The orientation of these people is just to having a nice time talking with their friends at dinner or whatever else. But non-thetically within that experience is that sense of how we do things, of yourself as part of a we enacting something. So here, so the situation then is quite parallel to the situation we had with the workers on the construction site. The difference is that other one was the we looked at, or someone looked at, that's enacted through a certain kind of materiality. Here, through this materiality, a kind of shared sense of how we do things as agents, as lookers, is what's as subjects, is what's being articulated and enacted. And let me give you another one. Sartre himself begins with this example when he talks about spectators in a theater. Right there, that's one of the places where you can really very sort of viscerally experience yourself as part of a we. Like you get really excited and you feel like you're part of a thing where everybody's excited about the band coming on stage, right? And so there you have a much more sort of vibrant sense of living out of a sense of a we, of a certain kind of sharedness. So you could think about again how in the very structure of theaters, in your ability to go in there and have something put up on the stage in front of you as a kind of spectacle, and have all of your seats or non seats, whatever it is, standing area, sitting area, arranged so that you're all looking in the same direction, right? The material setting tells you, here's what we're going to do now. And you sort of slot yourself into the role to be part of that shared subject doing its thing, right? So the theater is where that's sort of more viscerally immediate, that sense of belonging, because you might actually be sort of going to the show because you want to hear the music, but you also really love the feeling of the being part of that collective. Whereas in the dinner, if we go back now and look at the dinner picture, that's the same thing as going to the theater, or as going to the rock show, whatever it is. Though here, your focus is probably more on the sort of intimate and specific activity you're oriented towards, and you rely on your sense of belonging to a we subject, but it's probably not so viscerally immediate and not so immediately important to you, right? But in each case, that's actually what's happening here. That's actually an integral kind of non-thetic structure of your experience. I want to just say one more thing about this, and I really basically just want to bring up one word that Sartre uses. This is on 549, he uses it for sure. He probably uses it in other places too. But on 549, he especially brings up this notion of rhythm. And he said, it's in certain kinds of experience of rhythm that you can especially feel these things. And so he says, that's, for example, what's happening when soldiers are marching in rhythm. The cadenced marching allows each individual soldier to feel like in the thing he's doing, he's part of this other thing, right? In a kind of an obvious way. And that's what happens in those concert scenes. If everybody claps together, maybe that's better. I don't know if people clap at shows like that, but if you go to a theater performance or the symphony, at the end of it, everybody's going to clap, and that's not exactly rhythm, but it's a similar thing, right? It's like this very specific activity we do where every one of our things sort of speaks with the other, right? But so there are rhythms sort of more simple and obvious, like the marching rhythm of the soldiers. Or there are rhythms that are more complicated and a little bit more subtle, that actually come out, for example, in that picture of dining in the restaurant, right? Rhythm is just the whole sort of choreographed way we go through the process of eating, of having each dish, of ordering, etc., etc. But so I just want to underline that word rhythm, and that the sense of picking up on a rhythm, and I want to encourage you to think about the kind of continuum from the sort of obvious and direct rhythms of shared marching all the way through the more subtle and complex, but also very pervasive rhythms of going through city streets, sitting in restaurants, and so on. And in fact, if you're interested in that theme of rhythm, I'll just mention I wrote quite a bit about that in my book, Bearing Witness to Epiphany. So if you ever wanted to look at that, you could see a little bit more of an exploration of the way rhythms come up in our lives. But anyway, I just want to read this one sentence from 549. He says, the enveloping of my rhythm by the rhythm of the other is apprehended laterally. I do not utilize the collective rhythm as an instrument, nor do I contemplate it. It surrounds me and involves me without being an object for me. Right? So that laterally thing is, again, this point of it sort of being non-thetic. Right? You slip into doing things in rhythm with others, and thereby feel like you're belonging. Right? So that's the last thing that I want to say in the last picture I wanted to look at, just to bring out this range of material ways that we feel like a we, initially in that sort of object sense, and now in this latter one in all these kinds of subject ways. And I just want to now conclude that discussion with one last point, and it's just a reminder of the point I made from the beginning. We have these experiences, and they're profound and very important. But the thing he's trying to get at throughout all of this is that you never actually have someone else's experience for them. Nobody else has your experience for you. You don't ever share experience in that sense. And the particular point he wants to make here is these experiences of the we subject and we object that we're just talking about, they are developed ways we have of taking up our experience with other people and developing ways of feeling like we belong in one sense or another. But he says these he says are psychological, not ontological. Whereas in the case of love and sex, he was saying those are ontological, not psychological. So the point he was getting at there is, in other words, those initial relationships of love and sex are the necessary forms, the meaningful experience of others always takes in anyone's life. Whereas he's saying here, we're looking at very refined ways. We establish systematic practices that are our ways of dealing with those core experiences. So in that sense, there is no new dimension of subjectivity or being for others that's exactly introduced here. Rather, you're seeing something more like the developed ways we work with that fact that we are inescapably stuck in the relationship of looking and being looked at. So that's a quick introduction to this material. I mean, there's lots more to say about it, but that's enough to bring out of this reading for the purposes of our ability to go on now and launch our study of the Critique of Dialectical Reason.